Welcome to Job Ready. Today, we are digging into a crucial piece of the job readiness formula. We have Kyle Minick, an expert on employee benefits, with us. Kyle is Vice President of Benefits, Employee Benefits at Summit Financial Group, where he's challenging the concept of benefits as cost management and instead championing a really strategic vision of benefits as true compensation. Thanks for joining us today, Kyle.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jeff and Charlie.
We're super glad. Kyle, let's start out by grounding our audience in this vision. So you teach a class at Tarleton State University on benefits as compensation. Can you tell us how that looks in practice and why it's a revolutionary idea?
Yeah, absolutely. And as much as I believe it's a revolutionary idea in practice,
Yeah.
it really is a concept that's been around for a while. And I think all of us, in a way, particularly those who are job seekers, look at benefits like they are compensation. But I think from the management side, but the business side, the bean counters, we're always kind of looking at, what does it cost us? What is our tax burden? What does the medical insurance cost? What does our contribution floor have to be? With the passage of the ACA, all of that fundamentally and radically changed in many ways in terms of what that threshold or cost basis or even requirement became. And so from our perspective, and what we try to champion, is that benefits are compensation. And as employers, we need to start treating them like compensation, right? Not only in terms of what we're trying to offer from a compensatory package perspective, but how we view that as a tool in our relationship and employment relationship with employees themselves. The fundamental premise is called the functional approach to employee benefits, wherein I'm not just looking at these as expenditures. I'm looking at them as variables in a overall compensation formula that address specific employee needs in their life, right? Like the easiest way to frame that is, why do we pay employees salary? Well, one answer to that might be to say, well, because they're doing work, we have to pay them something for that. But the reality is that when we want an employee to stay for 5 to 10 years to 15 years, that value, that number, has to be not only enough to cover the bills, but allow them to grow in different financial aspects. And so as we look at what that value becomes over time, we then also have to say, okay, well, over the course of 10 years, the likelihood of one large financial expense occurring, particularly in the medical sense, and we'll just focus on, because that's the largest expenditure, but something medically will happen to me at some point or another, especially once you start adding kids into the mix, right? I just had to take my 1-year-old to the emergency room, a couple weeks ago. He's fine. But he just cut his head, but we had to get stitches, right? And that's a financial burden. And when you look at the fact that the average American doesn't have $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 in the bank to cover that random expenditure, what happens in that situation? Well, it goes on a credit card. It goes in, or we pay for it in other ways. So that medical insurance that you're providing your employee is actually protecting that employee's financial future. It's actually protecting and giving them a value add as a form of pure compensation to say, I'm going to pay you this for the widgets you make or the units of labor that you produce, but I'm also going to give you some of these safeguards as a way for you to protect that which I'm also providing. You're going to be able to pay your bills. You're going to be able to, maybe put a little bit in savings or invest a little bit, but we're also going to provide you mechanisms of employee benefits that are designed fundamentally to create that protection. And when we frame the conversation that way, not only with ourselves, but with employees, they feel more valued. They feel that there is there's a guiding principle behind that compensation strategy that goes beyond, I want you to be here for 40 hours a week, maybe 50 if we're busy, or maybe 60. And that's all I care about. I don't care about you, the individual. And so the communication aspect of those benefits has to be matched and paired with what that vision really becomes.
It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense from an employee standpoint, Kyle, but you mentioned something like, the bean counters, for lack of a better expression here. And I'm using your words. It's not being appreciated in the same way, right? Or at least that's the impression that I receive from it. Why is that?
It's hard to say. And I'm not necessarily throwing HR folks under the bus here, because I think it's not their fault. But because they deal with benefits, they've been forced to deal with benefits over the years because they're deploying human capital, right?
That's right.
So it has kind of naturally fallen in that vein. But, a lot of business owners and CFOs are mainly concerned with what that bottom line is. What's my EBITDA? What's my, cost of goods sold? What's my P&L, right? And that's
rightfully so, right?
Right,
So.
absolutely. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I think what we're starting to see in the marketplace that I live in, which is the employee benefits consulting space, everybody's starting to understand that the cost of human capital loss is just as much of a P&L concern as anything else, right? The cost of the statistic that I always heard, and I'm sure it's ebbed and flowed here and there, but the cost of replacing somebody that leaves is about 4 months worth of that position's salary, give or take, right? Because you have to invest in the time spent and the labor to go recruit them. You have to take time to do that. Training costs, all of that stuff becomes salient. And so if you're a job seeker, especially when you're looking through that process and you're trying to find that employer that makes sense, maybe 30 years ago, a medical dental vision plan was the cream of the crop, right? Like that was the employer that everybody was vying for. Maybe you didn't. Yeah, you had to be a special person to fall into that category, or maybe in the executive class. Now it's an expectation, right? And when something goes from a value add to an expectation, I think across the marketplace, you find that the way that we appreciate those things also drops and declines, right? If it's something that like, oh, my employer gives me medical, dental, and vision, right? And that's something amazing, right? Then that's obviously going to have a high premium placed on it by the individual employee as well as the employer, because they are separating themselves from the pack by doing so. Now it's an expectation. So now it's become no different than, expecting there to be toilet paper in the bathroom, right? Like you kind of have to have them just to, play the game. But beyond that, it's something that I think that as we continue to see that, even though it's become an expectation, I think now employers are also starting to discover that there are ways to differentiate themselves within that landscape by not only how they communicate the benefits, but the deeper mechanisms of an employee benefit plan, particularly the health plan with fully insured or self-funded plans and bells and whistles and things you can fold into their voluntary benefits, all of the different things that kind of create that broader compensatory package.
Kyle, when you look at benefits, and I know you look at them holistically, and probably the biggest nut is that healthcare benefit. We think a lot about the tuition benefit as well, right? And when you're essentially marketing the compensation dimension of benefits, typically you market the entire list, right? So when you think of benefits as compensation, an HR leader comes to you and asks them to ask you to treat them strategically, to talk with them. Like, how do you treat tuition benefits strategically rather than transactionally? Because that seems to me to be what you're championing is this is strategic, this is relationship, this shouldn't be regarded as a simple transaction, right? It's more than that.
Well, it's a good question. So there's really two facets. There are two ways that I'll answer that. First is short, second's long. The first is that in the insurance world, especially like when we're looking at medical, dental, vision, and things like that, a lot of the industry has been trained to live and breathe in this 12-month time horizon, right? Our plan lasts 12 months. We renew it every 12 months. And so we're only going to look at cost drivers and so on and so forth within that context. We try to coach people to get out of that mindset and start living in a 3 to 5 year strategic horizon. And I think you extend that over into the tuition benefit realm as well, right? Because the biggest concern, if I'm an employer leveraging a tuition reimbursement program, I need tenure, right, from these employees to justify the expense. Because if you look at the marketplace at large, I mean, tuition is not getting cheaper. So if we're going to create a meaningful output from that benefit program to that employee, I mean, again, thinking about the functional approach, what does this do as a form of compensation? Lowers my debt to income ratio over time, lowers the or expedites the time horizon by which I get out of debt, right? So that's valuable. But when the debt was $15,000, it was a hell of a lot easier to manage than when it's now 150, right?
Yeah.
So employers have to be more strategic in terms of what they're willing to give up front and how soon they're willing to give it. You kind of think of it a lot like vesting schedules and retirement plans, because that's how a lot of these tuition reimbursement programs are set up now, is deferred employer contributions or almost deferred compensation programs, wherein we're treating it like a retirement plan schedule where you are vested in what we will pay on your tuition reimbursement over time. But it also has to be appropriately paired with those that you're maybe trying to upskill. Right? It's not just limited to those who are coming out of college and into your organization, but how are we going to help them? Yes, but that's a different kind of benefit from saying, hey, I'm willing to chip in and help you avoid debt up front versus helping you repay it on the back end. And
Yeah.
so pairing those two things, finding methodologies to get people to understand that if you're going to enter into this arena, this is not a short-term play. You have to be prepared to commit for probably the next decade at minimum into this program so that you can really see the return that you're looking for, not only from a retention perspective, a recruitment perspective, but also just a pure dollar perspective of, okay, input, output, how much more efficiency, how much more loyalty, how much more widgets, how many more widgets am I going to get out of these individual units or individual people? Not that we think of them as units, but just purely from, from the value of what we're providing to these employees.
Yeah. It's what I hear that's really resonant is retention, productivity, lowering that churn cost, which, I mean, we've heard that, I think one of the reasons Gen Z gets such a bad rap is, churn rates of like 40% in year one, 50% year two, and that costs a lot for companies, right? When you think about benefits and an era where people move jobs more quickly than they ever have before, the impact of AI, which, I mean, we hear everywhere, but the truth is the speed at which AI is moving means that, competitive threats are moving faster. And we're not talking about, years or even months sometimes, things are changing all the time. How can benefits be built to keep up with that new pace of business? It seems like they were built for a different era. You and I met and kind of talked about that a little
Yeah.
bit.
Well, they really are.
Yeah.
Insurance programs are not new. They're not sexy. You know, for the, I also think that part of the functional approach to employee benefits is also meeting your people where they at, right? The 65-year-old that just got onboarded to your team doesn't really care about your retirement plan. They're already at that time horizon. They could put $100,000 in there, and by the time they retire, it's going to be 110, right? Or
Yeah.
you're not
Yeah.
going. They're not going to see that value as much as they will, for example, medical insurance, and that being sustainably cheap or having certain benefit thresholds. Gen Z and the younger generations care infinitely more about that retirement program than they do medical insurance, right? So you have different facets of the benefit program that are going to fit certain segments, and how you communicate those benefits and the value and treat them as compensation that's directed towards that, and then train managers on how to speak that language. That's all really important. But I also am a big proponent that true employee benefit does not live exclusively in insurance and retirement programs, right? It lives in your HR policy. It lives in your communication of ethos and vision and strategy to these employees. The biggest thing that Gen Z people care about are not benefits. They care about compensation, but what they want to really care about, what they want to know, is there a pathway for me here? I don't necessarily subscribe to the ideology that Gen Z individuals just want to bounce around. Nobody enjoys that level of disruption. Nobody enjoys having to sit at the desk and be trained for 2 weeks or go through some learning boot camp at the home office in Chicago for 6 months before they actually get to start doing their job.
Yeah.
Maybe that jazzes some people up, but I doubt that the majority of folks enjoy that lifestyle. My point being that I think if you can appropriately train your managers, your HR team, your onboarding folks to communicate not only what your compensatory package is, why these benefits meet these people where they are in their lives, but also how your organization is going to steward these people into their career path, into their future that they envision for themselves. Whether or not it's realistic or reasonable from a time horizon perspective, we all wake up from that delusion at some point or another. Not all of us are going to be Jeff Bezos and build $1 billion company in the matter of 5 years, right? Like that,
Yeah.
that I don't think anybody really lives at that level of delusion, but I think there are people coming out of college who do believe that just because they got that degree, they're worth 140 grand a year, right? Like there's some really interesting studies done by SHRM, the
Yeah.
Society for Human Resources Management, that they just completed on these different generations believe their starting salary should be, but what they value, what they think is important. It's fascinating. But there's also this generational difference of ethos in terms of how we approach job interviews, how we approach the workplace, how we approach work-life balance. And I think that if you find a way as an employer to not only do all the things that you need to do on the financial side and protect them, but communicate that vision, find that pathway, and then, for lack of a better term, indoctrinate them into that vision, that in and within itself is an employee benefit that can create that retention pathway that you're looking for. Because somebody who feels valued and not only feels the value, but feels that they can create value long-term and be rewarded for it, that's what everybody's fundamentally looking for. It's just that the Gen Z folks and the younger folks are much more adamant about the latter half of that than, for example, our parents or our generations that maybe went into it with a little bit more of a cynical viewpoint, which is like, hey, we're going in there, we're going to work, we're going to get paid, we're going to go do what we want to do afterwards. But those two things aren't necessarily tied together. Gen Z and the younger generations absolutely pair those together, like hand in hand.
Kyle,
Yeah.
on the topic of the pathway, can we double click a little bit on the tuition benefit? Because I think the insurance it has practical day-to-day implication, right? But for a lot of folks, tuition benefit, and I'll just and I'll just share with you the view that we've heard often from employees that we've talked with, where a lot of them is it's sort of like a catch-20. They want to make it available, but at the end of the day, it's an expense, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about how, in your world, and how you talk to folks about changing that paradigm shift, if you in fact believe that it should be not viewed as as an expense, but really as an investment, not only for retention, but productivity, upskilling, and the whole 9 yards?
Right. So I think that the easiest way I can explain it, like if I'm targeting this conversation to an employee, right?
Yeah.
And I want them to look at it as not an expense, is that frankly it is an expense, right? My contribution to my 401k is an expense. But why am I making that contribution? For future financial benefit. And particularly for younger individuals, they need to understand, in my opinion, and it's not that they're foolish or they just don't get it. It's just that sometimes we have to slow down long enough to remember that things that are inherent to us are not necessarily inherent to others. So we have to maybe guide them a little bit, which is just to say that incremental growth, it creates exponential return, right? Like we all want the windfall of $100,000 that lets us pay off our debt tomorrow, right? We all want to believe in that hope, for a lack of a better term. But if I take $100 a month or even $50 a month and put it into that tuition reimbursement program or that, however it's structured, I'm going to see that return over time. And it's going to significantly shorten the window. So like if I'm making $150 tuition loan payments, right, every year for the next 30 years, okay, well, that's an expense I'm having either way. If I can reconstitute that in a different format, get return on those dollars that I'm putting into that program, and then pay it back in, let's say, 20, that's 10 years of financial functionally liquidity that I've created just by eliminating that debt. And that's massive. What can I do with that money instead over the course of that 10 years? Again, that incremental methodology or that mindset, that improvement and growth happens in small clips and not in giant leaps and bounds. And it's no different than the 22 years that they spent or in school. Right? Like you
What about the
didn't
employers?
learn trigonometry in 1 year. You learned trigonometry after building that foundation for 18 years.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense, Kyle, from an employee. And obviously, we, as the name of this podcast, Job Ready, and we focus on education. We are a huge believer and promoter of education in general. But where from the employer's point of view, right? I mean, the participation rate is pretty darn low for a lot of companies.
Right? Because it
And
is an expense. It's extra. People have
correct.
to be willing to participate, right? And that leads to a different kind of conversation of, if I have a lower participation rate, am I as an employer contributing enough and making it salient enough, or let's say, enticing enough to participate, right? Am I paying my people enough to actually allow them to participate? Because again, like I said, I don't think there's any two ways about it. It is an expense. It's absolutely an expense. It's another line item on that I'm contributing toward. Is it an investment? Yes. Is it going to be great in the long run? Yes. Is it creating that incremental growth? Yes. But it is an expense, and I have to be able to afford that. If I'm making $50,000, my rent constitutes 30% of my income, and that's being generous nowadays to a degree if you look at statistics. And I have all of these other expenses, daily living, energy costs are going up, cost of the gas pump is variable at any given moment. Okay, well, then what do I do about that? Can I afford to issue another, $100 out of my check a month into a different kind of account, or am I going to hold on to that so that I can potentially pay my bills or address the windfall that we're talking about when it comes to potential medical debt, car debt, or anything else that comes up as a result of just daily life. So that's kind of It's kind of how I look at it. I mean, if you have a low participation rate, it's not because people don't care or don't want it. It's because fundamentally the program itself needs to be readjusted or restructured, or you have to look at your compensatory program and understand whether or not it's even achievable for the majority of your people. And if it's not, and you can't or don't want to change that, okay, then that's fine, but don't be surprised about the low participation rate. You certainly can't gripe about it, right?
Kyle, when you look at the stats on this type of benefit, typically what we see is that it's a reimbursement situation, right? And that out-of-pocket expense is probably a big deal to somebody making and even 100,000 a year, right? If it's reimbursement based, I mean, and you probably have a broader perspective than we do dealing in benefits, but if it's reimbursement based and the market is moving as fast as it is, you get probably trained and upskilled in AI, for example, right now, and you need to get upskilled in AI again in the not too distant future, right? And so this out of pocket expense, do you think that's what's pushing down participation rates? Because even if the employer had a generous benefit and was at that $5,200 kind of limit per year, no matter what, if you got to do out of pocket, you're thinking, I don't know if I can afford that right now, right? But I mean, what are you seeing? What do you think about that?
I think it all comes down to plan design and plan structure. How
Yeah.
quickly are you reimbursing folks? Is it possible to front load that? Can you avoid the reimbursement game altogether? I mean, those are all options. It's just depending on how you go about it or how you set up the structure in the program. But I think those kinds of decisions that you're referring to are really going to be incumbent upon the employee, because what you're also asking them is to invest time.
Yeah.
Right. And the upskilling, the education commitments therein, is there a retention agreement they have to sign in order to obtain those reimbursements? All of those things become part of the equation. And when you have, again, looking at that potential aspect of I'm not being compensated enough to even begin to play this game, then you start finding yourself in that same conversation around, is this person going to leave? Right. Because they're not getting paid enough and they can't even afford the upskilling that I want them to do. And great, I'm going to reimburse them, but can they pay their bills in the month, long lag between paychecks, or, whatever, again, however form and function you might be executing this program on. I just think I think it has to be a collaborative discussion between employee and employer. And you have to allow yourself enough flexibility as an employer to meet your employees where they're at and based on their needs.
Do you think is the reimbursement format that Jeff brought up, what's the key driver there? Is that because of the risk mitigation on the employer side of not having to deal with clawing back the money and potentially being on the hook for something that they really don't directly benefit? Or is it more of a laissez-faire where, it's an expense, it's not something that we really want to promote, and therefore we're not going to invest time and effort and technology to turn it?
I think it's a commitment issue.
From who? Employer or the employee?
They want to see commitment from the employee. Show me that this is work, that you are going to initiate this. Because I'll put it this way. I myself have had employees that I've paid for a program up front and then they didn't do it. Right. So because they didn't, we talked about it, it seemed good on paper. We both wanted to do it, but when it came time for actual execution, this individual didn't do it. Right. So it's hard to, and I'm not painting with broad strokes. This isn't going to be applicable to everyone. Some people are going to, pick up the basket and run, but not everybody will. And so if you're talking about the best way to make sure that you're going to see that money be used appropriately, it's kind of like when you have your kid, they want to, buy something, you want to make it worth your while. You don't want to just buy something for $100 and have it go down the toilet. So you're like, go get a job, earn your own money, and then you can go buy it. Well, they go earn their own money and then they buy it. That's a level of commitment that you can't argue with, right? And I'm not suggesting that that's, again, like a universal maxim that, employers should or should not use, but I think that's part of the mindset and the mentality behind preference for those reimbursement programs rather than kind of upfront funding. But again, it depends on how you have it structured. Like if I'm engaging in this upfront methodology, I could set that employee up for a retention agreement and a payback agreement that says, you don't execute within the specified time frame or so on and so forth, I'm going to claw that money back from you, because I can't go get it from the financial institution, or I can't go get it from the school. I can't go get it from these things. If you didn't go to class, you didn't go to class. You don't pass, you don't pass. So there has to be, I think there's middle ground there. But again, it's situational. I think size of the employer also becomes relevant. Like, how difficult is it to administer these programs on an upfront basis versus on a reimbursement basis? How many agreements do I need with all of these different employees before it becomes like taxing on my HR staff just to manage those programs? Right. And then you have to get accounting involved to make sure that that everything is being allocated and, assessed correctly. Is there a vesting schedule involved? So again, I think degree of complexity, willingness to trust probably might be a good way to think about it. And the employee's actions all become salient in that conversation.
Kyle, you mentioned something earlier about just before Charlie's question about the collaborative conversation on benefits between the employer and the employee. What does that look like? I haven't witnessed that myself. You witness best case scenarios. What do people do?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, I think it's just as any sort of compensatory agreement, right? I think that everybody should be, if you're a job seeker in particular, should be looking at the conversation that you have in the interview process around salary, or once you get that job offer and then that negotiation begins. You should be looking at the benefits as a part of that conversation too. Again, I think that the advice that we get from our parents or the advice that we get from some of the older generations is you just need to make sure that you have these things. Okay, well, that's fine, but there is an education that we should all be indoctrinating our children into and our workforce into, which is to understand what is a class of employee, right? Can I be treated differently from other people? Or do we have just a universal contribution strategy at this employer? Can I get them to pay for more? Can I create more value for myself? Can I get better PTO terms? Can I get better, X, Y? All of these things are on the table, but we have to ask those questions and understand what those facets are. I mean, if I walked around, hell, if I walked around my own organization into different divisions and departments that don't do employee benefits, but are in other aspects of financial services, and I ask them what class of employee is, I guarantee 1 out of 10 can answer the question. 9 out of 10 cannot, right? And that's not indicting or anything, but by that same token, those are the back end mechanisms that HR teams work within and that financial teams work within the organization when they're setting forth what those programs look like for employees. So if you don't take the time as said employee to understand what those things could be, well, then you might be short selling yourself a little bit. So from a collaborative perspective, it's just a matter of saying, do I know enough? Can I asking the right questions, understanding the deeper ends of those benefit programs? And then when it comes to the HR teams and the financial teams putting these programs together, part of that functional approach to employee benefits is actually figuring out what your employees really need, looking at the stratification of generations across your workforce. And if I have a heavily lopsided format towards like an older generation, then I might want to put more money into the medical plan and that contribution, and maybe scale back my retirement plan contribution matched by 2%, or get down to the safe harbor limit or whatever that might look like, right? So all of those things have to be taken into account, and how you structure those things creates the collaborative approach that you're really looking for when you're attracting employees, but more importantly, when you're retaining them, right? I have absolutely nothing to back this up statistically, but I truly believe it's probably a hell of a lot harder to retain an employee than it is to get them in the right, because it's kind of like the old sales maxim, like what's the worst that could happen? They say no, and you're right where you started already. But once they say yes, keeping them in that chair becomes paramount to the organization's success, and making sure that they buy into that vision, they buy into what you're selling, that your compensatory package is valued, that they feel valued, that they feel they have that forward path. It's really, really important that we figure out what's important to them to give them that.
How can you talk to us a little bit about, you mentioned there's a lot of different generations in the workforce today, which is, very unique, right? How are employee benefits today being administered to attract and retain and provide pathway versus 20 years ago? And then if you can kind of provide us with a crystal ball for a moment here, given AI is dominating the conversation in all aspects of our life right now, what does that look like 5 years from now, or even 2 years from now when it comes to benefits?
So that's a very difficult question to answer, but I'll give it my best shot and read the tea leaves as best.
That's our job, Kyle. We're trying to ask you a difficult question.
There you go. You got it. So I'll start with the first half of that, which is really just around, the nature of benefit programs and how we're using that to retain talent, right? Or across generations or across the format of age. Frankly, I think from an insurance product perspective, it doesn't. Used to 20, 30 years ago, it used to. If you had those programs in place, people would not leave because, let's say 6 or 7 out of 10 employers did not have those programs. The competitive pool that you as an employer were competing against from talent was different. It was smaller. Now everybody has the same benefits. Everybody has a medical plan. There's a law in this country that says if you have over 50 employees, you have to offer a medical plan, and it has to be quote unquote affordable, right? So, statistically, you're going to encounter that most Americans get their insurance through their employer, right? Just statistically. So I don't know that insurance programs are doing that. I don't know that they are competing or again, like helping an employee or an employer compete. Now, that's not always the case. I think that in what I'm seeing in my industry in particular is more and more employers are shifting to self-funded health plans. And self-funded health plans allow you a wild amount of freedom to manipulate the program. You don't just have to take what's off the shelf from a Blue Cross or United or a Cigna or none. You can manipulate these programs to fit your employees' needs. I can help. I just did this. We just helped an employee get a $16,000, or actually it was $18,000 drug for $5,000. And we're giving it to them for free because the health plan is saving that much more money, right? And that's a self-funded health plan. You can do those kinds of things. You can give employees free surgeries. You can create pathways towards medical tourism. You can create a dynamic or a style of plan that actually doesn't just protect those employees, but keeps them from spending the money altogether. And that's something that you can compete with if you know how to communicate it in the recruitment process. If you're educating your recruiters and your HR staff to be proactive about that, to sell the value of that, and not just say we have a... Now, how's AI going to change the world of employee benefits? It's difficult to say again. You have carriers that are trying to leverage the power of AI to do things like underwrite programs. They're using them for the purpose of reducing administrative cost, which theoretically reduces premiums. Although when that starts happening, I'll let you know, which is another reason why people are moving to self-funded health plans, because it seems to be one of the only ways that you can control the cost of service. And I mean, we could literally spend 2 hours talking about why cost of service is the way that it is. But fundamentally, the fight between insurance companies and hospital systems and the aggregation that's happening on both sides of that equation is driving costs through the roof. So finding ways to take that down and bring it not only to the company level, but to the employee level can be very impactful. And there are ways to use AI to do that. There's claims adjudication tools that might, kind of streamline some of these things, but the human element of benefits is never going to be fully removable, because there's always the doctor making those decisions of what care pathways should be. And there's almost always a billing specialist behind the scenes that's sending those numbers and putting that bill together to send to the health plan. So how we figure those things out is important too. But I think the biggest impact that you're going to see AI have in the benefits realm in particular is in how we administer benefits and how we educate benefits and how we do care navigation, right? Like if I have this really complex program that I put together for an employer, I have to have somebody who's advocating for the employee, right? Because real life decisions don't involve like an hour's worth of deliberation before it happens. Like if my child is sick and I have to take them to the emergency room, I'm not going to slow down and think through all of those different things that I should probably think through financially to figure out what the lowest net cost is here, there, wherever. That's going to keep my out-of-pocket cost down. I'm going to take them to the nearest emergency room and get it dealt with, right? And so while emergency situations and within themselves that have a human element to them that cannot be controlled, what happens when I go to my specialist or my physician, I take an x-ray, find out that I need a surgery, right? What's happening right now is that most people just go wherever that doctor tells them to go and don't think about that cost metric. AI can enter into that like intermediary process and say, hey, we see that you had a pre-authorization or a referral over to this specialist. There's nothing wrong with that. These are the quality metrics of that provider, but here's 3 others because this provider is going to cost you $2,000. Right? Or whatever your deductible is, whatever your out-of-pocket max is. If you go here, we'll give it to you for free, or it'll cost you $500 or $1,000 or whatever that looks like. And so we can create lower claim costs to create lower premiums, because that's the biggest thing that I think a lot of people forget about insurance programs is that fundamentally it's a very simple ratio: premiums versus claims. How much money are we putting into the pot versus how much money are we using? If we're using more than we're putting in, premiums are going to go up. If the cost of services are going up, naturally the cost of premiums are going to go up in tandem with that. We're never going to win that inflationary battle, but what we can do is help employees at that point of decision making have the resources necessary to make appropriate financial decisions for the plan and themselves, which helps us control that cost ongoing. And if I have an employee who hasn't had a premium increase on their insurance for 5 years, but then we have all these news stories talking about how the cost of health insurance is constantly rising, they're going to want to stay where they're at because they're going to feel the value in their pocketbook. And then in tandem with that HR team communicating it as compensation, it feels like compensation.
So Kyle, self-funding is more of a for employers, right? Because from an employee point of view, they just want to know that they have the benefit and they can use the benefit. Is more for the employer in terms of giving the flexibility to control, but in some way it requires a lot more proactivity from the employer to
Absolutely.
manage, right? To kind of adjust accordingly. If you can correlate from that component over to the tuition benefit, is there a self-funding component to it? Because most tuition benefit to me, quite frankly, is pretty boring. It's like 50 at most, because that's the IRS limit. But then everything else is just sort of not being leveraged, not being proactively leveraged to really increase the productivity and the career pathway and all that stuff. So I'm curious if there is where you see there's a correlation between that.
Well, it's really more of a tax code question than anything else. And we're talking about two different sides of law, right? Like tuition reimbursement programs live in their own tax code space versus ERISA programs, like a health plan or a retirement plan and things of that nature. There are ways to structure tuition reimbursement programs as a form of investment plan rather than just saying, hey, this is what we're going to reimburse you on an annual basis, submit your receipts and you'll get it pre-tax. But in terms of tuition reimbursement, it's hard to say whether or not you can really choose to self-fund unless that employee or you are willing to take on a tax burden that goes beyond the allowable reimbursement amount. If we want to talk about what self-funding is in health plans, self-funding is fundamentally creating your own insurance company. You want to self-fund a tuition reimbursement program past what you already have or what you're allowed to do from a taxation perspective, there's going to be a cost associated with that you're going to self-fund. So, I mean, I think there's opportunity there, but I honestly think that the entire arena of tuition reimbursement programs needs to be overhauled in a significant way from a tax code perspective to allow for higher amounts because they have not kept up with inflation of tuition. They have not kept up with the actual cost of doing business in the United States for employers and employees. And it certainly hasn't kept up with employee wages. So the need for overhaul from a regulatory perspective is probably really needed in that category before you can figure out more creative ways. And I think if you can find a way to deregulate that a little bit and create a little bit more flexibility and freedom in that code, you might find some good pathways.
Kyle, you think about benefits kind of like my concept of a jet pilot with a heads-up display. You've got all these things going on. You've got the target. You're seeing everything in such a dimensional way. It's been such a pleasure talking with you today. I got to tell you, I'd love to have you back on at another point and
Sure.
talk more.
I'd love to be back, and I can't thank y'all enough for joining me. I love having conversations like this because we're nerds about benefits and things like this, and it allows us to kind of flex our creative chops a little bit. And I appreciate the philosophical discussion, if nothing else.
It's fabulous. Thanks very much for joining us today. We sure appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Kyle.